Good evening, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Conservation Conversation, Season 6, Episode 12. Can you believe 12 episodes into the season already? Many people joining us from all around the world, all different corners of the globe. Ohio in the United States. Hi there, Janet. All the way from UK, Neil Kenyon. Port Edward, some people even tuning in from Cape Town, which Cape Townians might believe is indeed another part of the world. It certainly sometimes feels like that when it gets to the weather. But a pleasure to have every single one of you joining this evening, no matter from where you're busy tuning in. And of course, we greatly value and appreciate the support. Keep those messages coming in. We'd love to see where you are all busy coming from. And very exciting topic tonight indeed. But before we get into that, remember you can follow the conversation with regards to conservation using the hashtag conservation conversations. And of course, follow us, BirdLife South Africa, on all of our social media platforms. We do have a new Facebook page as well. If you've not followed it, please make sure that you do so. YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, and of course, you can visit our website as well. And if you happen to miss any episodes of Conservation Conversations, you can catch up for free in your free time on YouTube. Head over to the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel, press subscribe, and there is a specific section on the YouTube channel dealing with conservation conversations. So every single presentation or episode is available for you to listen on repeat and to truly share it. You can share it with your friends, family, colleagues as well. This is all done free of charge and out of the goodness of our hearts and the interest in sharing the news on conservation with everybody out there, all like-minded birders and people who love nature. And we would value and appreciate any kind of support that you would deem appropriate. So if you do want to support us, you can scan that QR code or head over to www.birdlife.org.za/BLSA conversations. Now, tonight's episode is done in partnership with Birding Ecotours, and they have very generously presented and provided this opportunity for all watching tonight's episode, but extending the offer most generously to the 15th of July. So in the event that you were to book any of Birding Ecotours' trips within 7 days of tonight's episode, you will receive a 5% discount on your tour. And more importantly, we will get 5% donated to us here at BirdLife South Africa and the crucial conservation work that we are involved in. Birding Ecotours supports the organization and has historically for many years, and the generous support funds positions, specifically Matthew Orolowitz, the Birding Ecotours Grasslands fellow of Grasslands Conservation in Wackerstrom, and various other support over the years. And we are extremely grateful to Birding Ecotours and the support that we get from them as an operator. So please, everybody, contact info@birdingecotours.com. You can have a look at their vast array of global tours at their website, and don't miss out on the deadline. And on to tonight. Many of you probably have seen the news having filtered through over the recent weeks. The word AviList has been thrown out there. It's a foreign thing. People have told us we need to remove birds off of our list. And, it really has been quite a shocking state of affairs that have materialized. But never fear, because Chris is near. And Dr. Chris Lotz this evening is gracing us with the opportunity to provide more insight into birds, birding, and South Africa's bird names. Now, Chris has an extensive resume and is well known amongst the birding community, the CEO and founder of Birding Ecotours, but also the chairman of the BirdLife South Africa List and Rarities Committee. And Dr. Chris Lotz, shall I say, has always had an interest and passion in birds and birding, as is indicated by his involvement as the CEO and founder of Birding Ecotours and his support for the organization. Chris holds a doctorate in African sunbirds through the University of Cape Town and also did a 2.5 year postdoctorate at the University of Wyoming on hummingbirds. Whilst in Wyoming, Chris came to the realization that the world of academics and lecturing, albeit a rewarding career, in fact got in the way of actual birding. I think many of us can relate to that, Chris, in that our jobs tend to get in the way of actual birding. I think many of us at BirdLife South Africa are fortunate because we are actually in a position where our work involves birds. And I think that is what you've done exactly through Birding Ecotours. The goal of Chris's decision to create Birding Ecotours and Fund was to allow him to travel the globe and all 7 continents extensively. And obviously, in doing so and through the tours, to make a difference to bird conservation. And that obviously really is one of Birding Ecotours' most unique features. And 10% of the company's annual profits go to bird conservation and disadvantaged local communities. Chris volunteers for BirdLife South Africa and, as mentioned, serves as the chairman of the List and Rarities Committee. It is an absolute honor, Chris, to have you joining this evening. We are all very, very, very much looking forward to your presentation. I see we have 319 eager viewers who are very, very interested in hearing more about tonight's topic. Chris, I'm going to invite you to turn your audio and your camera on and then to start sharing your screen. Everybody, I'm unsure if I mentioned, but Kurt Martin, who's a familiar host face, but also our communications manager, he is operating in the background handling tech support. So Kurt won't turn his video on, but he has asked me to convey his hello to everybody. So Kurt will stop sharing his screen shortly. And Chris, welcome. It is an absolute pleasure to have you return to Conservation Conversations.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, John. And yeah, it's great to be here. And thanks everyone for listening to this talk. So yeah, it's going to be quite a nice session, I think. And good to see so many familiar faces and such. So yeah, I'll start by sharing the screen and getting this slideshow up. Um, and I'm assuming everyone can see the screen okay. So yeah, as John mentioned, I'll be talking about South Africa's bird names and within the context of the country's official list, so South Africa's official bird list. And just to show the logos at the bottom of the slide, BirdLife South Africa, I volunteer for them. It's a real privilege to do so. As the chairperson of the South African Bird List and Rarities Committee. And then birding ecotours is how I earn a living. And yeah, the photos in this talk, I've included quite a few photos just to make the talk more interesting. And I've just grabbed them off the Birding Ecotours website. And they're not actually my photos because yeah, my photos are not as good as my colleagues. So for example, here I've got a photo by Dylan Vassapoli of South Africa's beautiful national bird, the blue crane. And I've got quite a few photos by Dominique Rowlandson, Andy Walker, also a couple of clients, for example, Tim Williams. So yeah, and so just what is in this talk, I'm going to just go through sort of briefly what I'm going to be talking about. So the sort of yellow or orange part is just a bit of background as to what is South Africa's official bird list. How does the South African official bird list relate to global bird lists, such as the eBird list or which is the same as the Clements list, the IOC, and this new AviList? And then, yeah, how do we deal with when a split or lump or any taxonomic change occurs in a bird that occurs in South Africa? How do we, at the South African Bird List Committee, how do we deal with that? And then that will sort of set the background for what I've shown in green here, sort of a bit of a talk about how do we choose the bird names, the common names or the English names for our South African birds. And how often do the names change? Do you think, are they going to be changing as often as they used to? And things like that. So I'm going to try and address things like that. And then, yeah, as always, as I mentioned, I'll be showing a bird photo or two in most slides. And this is a Cape Eagle owl. It's actually probably more easy to see in KZN and some other provinces in South Africa than it is in the Cape. So an interesting name. Photo by my colleague Dom Rowlandson. So I've had the great privilege of heading up the South African Bird List Committee for 16 years now. So just if you want to scan the QR code, you can you'll be able to go to the website, the landing page at BirdLife South Africa, where you can download this list from the most recent version, and you can get an Excel version or a sort of print or PDF version like this. And yeah, so I've been heading up this committee that prepares this list and updates it each year, and we've been going strong since 2010. So for the last 16 years, this was the very first cover. And each year we have South Africa's Bird of the Year on the cover. So in this case, for the very first one, is this beautiful Cape Town area localized endemic orange-breasted sunbird. So yeah, and I think someone is also probably going to put up the links. I think John or Kurt will probably kindly put up the links, but then you can also scan at the QR codes. So if you do want to scan the place where you can download the list from, you can even look at it during the talk as well. So I'd just like to sort of do some introductory facts and mention some introductory things about South Africa's official bird list. We deal with South Africa very strictly. So why should I even mention that? Well, most field guides of birds in the region deal with the whole of Southern Africa. So it's six and a half countries south of the Zambezi and Kunene rivers. So whereas we deal, strictly speaking, just with only South Africa, we do mention everything south of the Limpopo River. So in terms of endemics and near endemics, we do have a sub list within this bird list, mentioning the two very small countries that are almost entirely in the borders of South Africa, Eswatini and Lesotho. Another interesting fact is that the list and the Rarities committees, the BirdLife South Africa list and Rarities committees, they're combined into one committee just over a year ago. So the combined committees have 24 members, and most of whom are external volunteers, such as myself. But there are also 6 committee members who are staff members of BirdLife South Africa. And yeah, I currently chair the list committee, the list and Rarities committee. And then David Earless Smith, who is also here today on this talk. He does a lot of the work. Actually, when we make decisions, he will actually make the updates onto the list. So he is the administrator of the list, so to speak. And that it's a huge amount of work every year, because we do update things thoroughly every year, and with name changes and all kinds of other things. So South Africa's official bird list has currently 880 bird species. And in most years, it increases by 3 or 4 because of vagrants that get recorded. For example, one of the most recent new birds for South Africa's bird list was northern carmine bee-eater. So a vagrant one came further south than usual and was actually then included onto our list. Unfortunately, we're probably going to lose 3 species because of AviList and because they've lumped 3 species. So this year is not such a good year, and we'll probably lose 3 species unless people can find a few vagrants quickly for the rest of the year. I think that eventually we'll probably reach 900 species for South Africa, which is pretty impressive, really. So because in most years we do tend to add 3 to 4 species per year. So after a decade or so, hopefully we will be getting close to 900. And then, yeah, we've also got 113 red data species on our list, which is very unfortunate. So it's well over 10% of our birds are at some sort of scale or at some level threatened with extinction. Unfortunately, there's 7 species that are actually on the verge of extinction in South Africa. 2 of them were only recently upgraded to critically endangered, and that's sadly African penguin and Bertus lark. So I'm talking about on a global scale. But we do also on our list, we also show the local or just the South African red data status as well. So we show both those things on our list. Also on our list, we show very clearly all the endemics. There are a huge number. So there's 70 species that are endemic or nearly so to the area south of the Limpopo River. And we also have quite a few introduced or feral species, such as on Robben Island, we've got chukka partridge, peafowl, and then on the mainland, we've got things like common myna, common starling, house sparrow, etc. And currently, we've got 148 vagrants, but the number increases each year as new species get reported for the country. Recent additions were sharp-tailed sandpiper and lesser whitethroat in the last couple of years. As I mentioned, northern common bee-eater. So yeah, just to acknowledge the photographer of this beautiful localized Cape endemic that's photographed by, it was photographed by Dom Rowlandson, and very localized, close to the Cape Town area, but pretty common. So yeah, at this point in the talk, I would like to talk a bit about the global bird lists. So there's approximately 11,000 bird species in the world, and we've got about 8% of those in South Africa. So there's up until about a month ago, in fact, it's less than a month ago, there was 3 major world lists. The IOC, and then Clements, which is the same as eBird, and then BirdLife International. So BirdLife International is quite a recent bird list. We actually existed before them. So the BirdLife South Africa List and Rarities Committee, we started in 2010, and then the BirdLife International World List started a few years after that. And that's the reason we didn't ever follow them. We were already following the IOC. So we had picked the IOC as one of the most authoritative world lists to, so to speak, follow. But when I say follow, we follow them in terms of taxonomic changes, scientific name changes, splits and lumps and things like that. We don't second guess them because they were doing really great work. And Clements and eBird, they were, when we started, they were kind of losing momentum. But when eBird became more and more popular, they started gaining momentum again. So it really did become one of the truly big major world lists. And they gained a lot of momentum again. But yeah, historically, we at the South African Bird List Committee, we tended to sort of, so to speak, follow the IOC for various reasons. But then, yeah, very big news, as John mentioned in the intro, that these 3 bird lists, they merged into one, AviList. And yeah, AviList, you can download it if you just Google AviList, or it's actually just as simple as going to avilist.org. You can actually download 2 different forms of the bird list there, a sort of extended form and then a more concise form. And AviList, it recognizes 11,131 bird species across the world. And some of the other bird lists that AviList kind of replaces recognized just under 11,000 bird species. So not all the bird lists agreed on the exact same number of species in the world. Why is that? It's just slight differences in species concepts, how to define what a species actually is. So AviList defines a species as if there's 2 different organisms that are able to breed together, and produce viable offspring, they're considered to be the same species. And there are other quite well-regarded species concepts, such as the phylogenetic species concept as well. So the biological species concept, it works pretty well for birds. Doesn't work so well for other organisms such as plants, but it is being used by AviList because, as I said, it does work well for birds. So if you scan this QR code here, there's an article more about species concepts, taxonomy, the major world lists, and I also provide updates on there's basically an article there, and I provide updates on things that happen. For example, the thing that happened about 3 weeks ago, or 3 or 4 weeks ago, when AviList emerged, and the other bird lists are basically merging into that. So this slide also just gives quite a nice opportunity just to show a couple of foreign birds, not just South African birds. So the small bird on the bottom left, that looks a bit like a black crake, but it's actually a Sacalava rail, very, very localized Madagascan bird. Had the real privilege of going to remote parts of Madagascar last year with a photographer called Tim Williams, who got these photos. And this other one, it used to be called Tsingi Wood Rail. It's now called Tsingi Forest Rail. And also a very localized bird. You go to west central Madagascar to find it. And it's only in a tiny little pot. It's an interesting bird. It'll often jump onto these fallen logs, but it'll also jump up into rocks. So in the area that it occurs, it's a very rocky forest, basically. So real privilege to see those birds. We also saw things like slender-billed flufftail and Madagascar flufftail, Madagascar pochard as well, which is critically endangered. So back to the main topics of the talk. So I just want to also introduce you to why splits and lumps happen, because a lot of the bird name changes happen because of splits and lumps. So one example, there's this photo of the southern white-faced scops owl by Dom Rowlandson. And I had the privilege of seeing northern white-faced owl, or northern white-faced scops owl in Kenya last year. Those two were split some years back because of basically they're known now to be genetically more different from what they were previously thought to be. So they look very similar, but they are now known to be separate species. Similar sort of thing with this Orange River White-eye photo by Dylan Vasapoli. Orange River White-eye, it's got these sort of peachy flanks, otherwise it looks pretty similar to Cape White-eye. And as its name suggests, it occurs along the Orange River, as well as the Fish River in southern Namibia. And very common in its small area where it occurs. And due to sort of new genetic techniques and other scientific techniques, it's been sort of resolved out as a separate species, essentially. But some of these species can also be split simply because of a changing species concept or sort of different views on what a species should be. So sometimes a split or lump occurs because of that. Sometimes there will be a lump or a split because old data that was published a long time ago is re-looked at. For example, it's very interesting that Barlow's lark, it was split off Karoo lark by Peter Ryan and a few other authors. He was the first author on a paper some years back. And it was found to be genetically more different than expected from Karoo lark. So it was split off Karoo lark. But in that very same paper, there is some evidence, if you look at the results carefully, that Barlow's lark is actually closer to dune lark genetically. And it's sort of, it groups with dune lark more than what we expected, really. So it's only very recently, early this year, in fact, early 2025, that Barlow's lark was lumped with dune lark. At first, I didn't really necessarily agree with that, but looking at the data, I personally think it seems to be quite a solid decision, really. So there are cases where the IOC, who we used to follow in terms of taxonomic changes, etc., until AviList came onto the scene, we now follow AviList as of the last 3 or 4 weeks. So sometimes we feel that they've made an error. It's not common, but very rarely that does happen. For example, they prematurely split Pretoria rock thrush off short-toed rock thrush, which we didn't really think was correct based on the data. So we told them, and then they quite quickly listened to us and changed their list, and they lumped it again. So they removed Pretoria rock thrush and regrouped it, relumped it with short-toed rock thrush. So there is one area where we don't follow the IOC with, or now AviList, since the IOC is basically being taken over by AviList, as are the other major world lists. And that is with common or English bird names. So because there's that's sort of the main topic of my talk, which I'll now speak about for the next 4 hours. Only joking. The talk should still be another 35 minutes or so only. So not to worry, you're not going to be here all night. So yeah, how do we actually choose English names for South Africa's birds? The IOC, they quite often, for various different reasons, change the common name of a bird. Sometimes the reason that they use, or the reason for it, will be non-controversial. Sometimes it'll be quite controversial. So sometimes there's a very good reason for them changing the name. But either way, whether their proposed name change that the IOC and now from now onwards AviList makes, sometimes, or whether it's controversial or whether it's not controversial, we will go through quite a process, the 24 of us in South Africa's List and Rarities Committee. And what we'll do is that we'll try and get public input as much as we can. Then we'll discuss it within our committee. Then we'll have a vote. And very often, most committee members will vote almost unanimously to keep the old name. So that the effect of that is that it kind of brings stability to our bird names. So the bird names don't change as often as they used to. And more about that a bit later. So we will also then, once we voted, if we vote against what the IOC did, we will go back to the IOC and we'll tell them the reasons for our decision. Sometimes they'll revert to the old name. Sometimes they'll continue using their new name if they feel strongly about it. So just to explain the photo, this was a very old name change that happened when lesser double-collared sunbird was split into 2 different species. And the lesser double-collared sunbird became southern double-collared sunbird, which is a very common bird around Cape Town. And it's almost endemic to South Africa. And then the other species that was split into was Miombo double-collared sunbird, which is not a South African bird that occurs in Zimbabwe northwards. But that happened long before our time. So we've only been going since 2010 as the South African Bird List and Rarities Committee. And this name change happened before we even existed. So yeah, now I'm going to just start with one example of those sort of non-controversial name changes that do sometimes happen. So barn owl, this photo is by Andy Walker. Barn owl was actually split into 3 different species some years back. There's the American one, and then there's the eastern barn owl, which is Australasian essentially. And then there's this very widespread one. It occurs in South Africa, but it's also all over Africa. It's all over Eurasia. And the IOC decided to call it Western barn owl. Because it's such a widespread bird, we have very little say over what it's called in South Africa. So we did go through the due process. So our committee did vote on it, and we decided that we would just follow the IRC and indeed just call it Western barn owl. It's an appropriate name, very widespread bird, so not really controversial. And unfortunately, the name did have to change. No one likes name changes, but sometimes they just do have to change if there's a split, for example. So here are a few other examples of non-controversial name changes because of splits. So black-shouldered kite was split into three. The one that I've seen in California, it's now called white-tailed kite, the American one. Unfortunately, the Australians got black-shouldered kite, which was the name that we were originally using. And the one that occurs all over Africa and Eurasia is called black-winged kite. So we voted to basically just accept black-winged kite. We didn't like it because it caused a name change for our bird, but it's not very controversial. It is a very widespread bird. And then just quickly going through these other examples, common whimbrel, it became Eurasian whimbrel and Hudsonian whimbrel. The one occurring in South Africa is Eurasian whimbrel. So we voted just to accept that name. It's not the most abundant bird in South Africa, and it doesn't breed in South Africa. So yeah, we don't really have a say in its naming. Mongolian sand plover, that was split into Tibetan sand plover and Siberian sand plover. Very long time ago, it used to be called lesser sand plover. So it is very confusing. But yeah, it's quite a scarce bird. The one in South Africa, the split is the Tibetan sand plover. So, and it's scarce in South Africa. I had the privilege of seeing hundreds of thousands in Thailand earlier this year. So it's very common elsewhere, and it's pretty scarce in South Africa. I've only seen it once or twice in South Africa. And so we as a committee, unsurprisingly, just went along with what the IC had decided to call it Tibetan sand plover, as we have little say on it. Striated heron, it used to be called green-backed heron. That's been split into 4 different ones. The one we get is little heron. And then, very interesting photo, this Matthew Orolowitz, who John mentioned earlier, he got this photo, and he said he doesn't really want his watermark on it because the photo looks slightly fuzzy, and he said he's not that proud of the photo. But it really is an amazing photo because it actually proves that which of the 3 red-rumped swallows occurred in South Africa. So red-rumped swallow was split into 3 different species at the end of last year. European red-rumped swallow, African red-rumped swallow, and Eastern red-rumped swallow, which is largely an Asian bird. And yeah, fortunately, one of the 3 records from South Africa, Matthew had this photo of, which clearly shows the bicolored rump, which is probably the best feature to really identify the species on. So our committee, the South African List and Rarities Committee, we voted on the basis of this photo, and there was also one other photo, and the description behind the photos as well. And we voted to accept European red-rumped swallow onto the South African bird list. There's 2 other records of red-rumped swallow in South Africa, but the photos don't quite show which one. So we suspect that African red-rumped swallow, unsurprisingly, is quite a likely candidate for South Africa, but we haven't proven that it's occurred here. So, but just getting back to the main topic, the IOC chose the name European red-rumped swallow for the species that's occurred once in South Africa, or it's only proven to have occurred once in South Africa. So we didn't have much say in the naming. So then there's a different sort of category here. I've been talking about splits that cause uncontroversial name changes, but sometimes a lump will do the same thing. So these 2 birds, one is the Barlow's subspecies of dune lark on the left, photo by Lillian Vassipoli, and then the other photo is the classic dune lark photographed by Dominique Rollinson in central Namibia. They do look quite different, but genetically they're very similar. And um, they have actually just been lumped into one earlier this year. So there's what do you change the name to? Should we have changed the name when you lumped these both into the same species? You have to lose one name and then just keep the other name. Um, so we chose to keep Dunelark. There's quite a good reason for it. If you see the yellow part of the text, it's the nominate form. In other words, the form where both the subspecies and the species part of the scientific name are the same. Um, it kind of makes sense to keep the English name of that one, which was Dunelark. So we did basically just take a vote within our committee whether to follow that what the IC did, which was to use the name Dunelark, and we almost unanimously decided that would be okay. It's also quite fair on the Namibians that they just lost their only true endemic, unfortunately for them, and because the species now gets barely into South Africa, in the extreme northwestern Cape, in north of Port Nolloth, between Port Nolloth and the Namibian border in the Namib Desert. So, so once again, we just accepted the name change from Barlow's Lark to Dunelark. And then there's quite a few other examples of this, so which are not very controversial name changes that we just went along with due to lumps. So a lot of people seem to like the name rock-loving cisticola. So rock-loving cisticola used to be considered a different species from lazy cisticola. Also a very funny name, of course. And these two were lumped very recently, a few months ago, and we used the nominate name, the rock-loving cisticola. So we adopted the East African name. We do put the name lazy in brackets because the form that occurs in South Africa is the lazy subspecies. Plus, we also we like to list the alternate or the old name just to sort of try and help get people accustomed to what the old name was. But it's yeah, and then a similar example, Miombo and lesser blue-eared starlings, they were lumped. Miombo blue-eared starling, very rare bird in South Africa. It's actually a vagrant. So it's more a Zimbabwe northwards bird. And then lesser blue-eared starling occurs further north than that in Africa. But because they were lumped, we now call it lesser blue-eared starling, with Miombo in brackets because the southern form is the Miombo subspecies. Quite a strange one, dark-capped bulbul, which used to, when I was growing up, used to be called black-eyed bulbul. That it was lumped with other bulbuls that occur further north in North Africa and the Middle East, for example. And so we had to change the name to common bulbul, but the southern form is the dark-capped subspecies, which we place in brackets. And then white-breasted cormorant, that's been lumped with great cormorant, which is a very widespread world bird occurring on most continents, basically. But the one in South Africa does have a white breast. Something that's probably, well, it has actually happened. AviList has lumped Cape and Agulhas long-billed larks. It's a little bit controversial. There are some South African scientists who are trying to reverse this because they disagree that Agulhas long-billed lark should have been lumped with Cape long-billed lark. But currently, even if you see a long-billed lark near the southernmost tip of Africa in the Agulhas area, you'll have to call it Cape long-billed lark because that's the current name because it has been lumped. And you can, I'm sort of kind of hoping that we can show enough evidence that perhaps it should be split again, but we'll see. So then there's a completely different category that's got nothing to do with splits and lumps for sort of an uncontroversial reason for changing names of our birds. So unfortunately, there was a derogatory term that was considered offensive for two different species in South Africa. These birds used to be called Hottentot teal and Hottentot buttonquail, but Hottentot is considered a derogatory term. So we went through quite a big process and we got as much public input as we could. And then we got people's opinions. What should we call these instead? And there was quite a big consensus, it seemed, for using very nice descriptive names, bluebill teal, and then fynbos buttonquail from the habitat in which this occurs. It's probably this bird in flight taken by Dylan Vasapodi, fynbos buttonquail, is probably the most difficult fynbos endemic or Cape area endemic to see. And how Dylan managed to get a photo beats me. I've never got a photo of the bird, of that species. I've had the privilege of seeing it a few times before while guiding, etc. But yeah, so basically we first got public input and then we then voted within our committee, the the bird naming committee that I chair. We voted and we pretty unanimously decided to call them these names, bluebill teal and fynbos buttonquail, and to replace the previously offensive names for these birds. We approached the committee members at the major world lists, such as the IC and Clements, and they listened to us pretty quickly, unsurprisingly, and changed their names as well to align with us. So now, just to get to the more interesting part of the talk, is where the IOC proposes names that are actually quite controversial, and which we don't actually agree with, and which we resist. So something happened just a few months ago, is that Eurasian hoopoe and African hoopoe, they were lumped. And the IOC started calling it Eurasian hoopoe, which is very unfair on all the African birders because it's a very widespread bird all the way from Cape Agulhas, the southernmost tip of Africa, which is actually one of the best places to see it, De Hoop and those areas. And then it occurs all the way through Africa, breeds all the way through Africa, right through up to Morocco, etc. So, yeah, we felt that we had been quite cheated for the IOC to call this Eurasian hoopoe. We did explain that to them, and fortunately, they did listen to us. And I see that now the new AviList, which was only published 3 or 4 weeks ago, they've followed what we actually did. So we voted to call it common hoopoe, which is much more fair on both the Eurasian birders and the African birders. And then luckily AviList has done the same thing. But then there's a thing where we currently disagree with what the ISC did and what AviList is doing. It's wandering albatross. Wandering albatross, it was recently split into more than one species. The nominate one, so it's the part in yellow, so both the subspecies and the species scientific name are exulents, so that's the nominate form. We believe we could have just kept that as wandering albatross, but other major world list committees such as eBird and the IC and AviList now, they changed the name to snowy albatross, and it's kind of inconsistent, we think, because sometimes when a lump or a split occurs, you keep one of the existing names, but in this case, a completely new name was created, which I personally disagree with. And in fact, almost the whole of the committee, the South African Bird List and Rarities Committee, voted against changing the name to snowy albatross. Almost all of us voted to keep the name wandering albatross. So the South African name officially is still wandering albatross, but we do put snowy albatross in brackets just to acknowledge that other people in the world are calling it something different. This is a bird that many of us dreamed of seeing when we were young birders. I mean, it's wandering albatross, such a good name. It wanders the southern oceans. And a lot of the committee members on these world naming committees are from the Northern Hemisphere. Wandering albatross doesn't actually occur in the Northern Hemisphere. So I mean, we do have to consult with people from Australia, New Zealand, South America, etc. as well. But we're kind of hoping that that AviList will at some point potentially change the name after consulting with the other people involved in the areas where this bird occurs, to actually revert back to this name that even non-birders know. I mean, many non-birders know what a wandering albatross is. So, um, and then yeah, there's a very different sort of category of controversial name changes that the IOC proposes, and this is where the major world lists change names which we disagree with. So we vote against these in our committee. So in other words, most people in our committee vote against these things. So there was quite a move for the small bastards that occur in South Africa. We in South Africa and in Namibia, most of them are endemic to South Africa and Namibia and neighboring countries. And there's quite a move to call them Southern Black Bastard instead of Southern Black Korhaan. The same for the same with Karoo Korhaan. The major world lists wanted to change the name to Karoo Bastard. And the same for Blue Korhaan. They wanted to call it Blue Bastard. So we in our committee, the consensus was that we disagreed with that because you can always look at the genus name or the scientific name, or you can look at what family the bird is in if you want to see what it is. The bastard family actually consists of quite a few different genera anyway. Most of the small ones do occur in South Africa, Southern Africa, South Africa and Namibia largely, and 99% of people in those countries have always called them Korhans. So we've got no problem with calling them Southern Black Korhan. In fact, we think it's better than calling it Southern Black Bastard. And we don't really think that the English name has to align with the scientific name, because if people are more scientifically inclined, they can always look at what it is called, what the scientific name is, and then they can get more information, or they can look at the whole phylogeny, or they can look at what family the bird is in, if they want more information about the science. An English name or is a common name, so it doesn't really have to show what the scientific affiliation is necessarily of the bird. And then another very good example is the warblers. There's the tit babblers in South Africa and the parasomas in East Africa. They used to be in their own genus, Parasoma, but that genus was lumped into the genus Sylvia, which are the true warblers. So with that, the IOC and other major world lists, what they essentially did was that they decided to change the common name as well. So they changed the name of Layard's titbabbler to Layard's warbler. And the same for chestnut-vented titbabbler, they changed it to chestnut-vented warbler. I found that quite hypocritical in a way, because there's other birds in the same genus that their names weren't changed. So, for example, Eurasian blackcap, very common bird in England, for example, and Portugal and the whole of Europe. Very common bird in these areas in the summer. But instead of changing the name to Eurasian warbler or something, they kept the name Eurasian blackcap for it. But they changed the name of the titbabblers to warblers. Similar to whitethroats as well. So common whitethroat, lesser whitethroat, they're true warblers. And then an interesting one, this beautiful bush blackcap, which used to be in a unique genus, its own genus, but fairly recently, in the last couple of years, it was lumped into the Sylvia warblers as well. But no one rushed to change the name to bush warbler. So basically, we don't really agree that when the scientific thinking, if the genus name changes, we don't really believe that you have to change the English name or the common name. And it's not a problem. So if you want the information about the science, you can always just look at the scientific name, or the phylogeny, or whatever sort of information you actually want to look at. So we actually now call Layard's titbabler. That's what we call it, but we put in brackets warbler because we acknowledge that other people in the world do call it that. So now, just also mentioning, I've been focusing quite a bit on the IOC because largely we follow the IOC partly for historical reasons, because it was at the time when we started our list, it was one of the most, or it was considered one of the most authoritative lists. We had to follow one list, so we decided to follow them. But then there was also BirdLife International and Clements, which is the same as eBird. They had some strange names for some birds. For example, there are these two species that are endemic to Namibia and South Africa. So it's Karoo erymomola and cinnamon-breasted warbler. But Clements, for some reason, until very recently, was using quite obscure names for these birds that very few people in South Africa or Namibia had ever used. So they were calling Karoo erymomola, they were calling it yellow-rumped erymomola, and they were calling cinnamon-breasted warbler Koppie warbler. So there's obscure and rather old bird books that used to use those names, but 99% of South African birders and ornithologists have always known them by different names. So yeah, for years we were actually telling Clements and eBird that they should be using the local names ideally, in our opinion. And eventually they did actually change the names. And AviList, luckily, is using these names. So a bit of a non-issue now what the previous three world lists were doing, because they've all been combined into AviList, a sort of single unified world bird list. So we've only existed as the South African Bird List and Rarities Committee. We've only existed since 2010, so 15 to 16 years. So what happened prior to 2010? Name changes were absolutely rife. So different bird book authors would just use different names. For example, Newman would just use different names from the authors of Roberts or Sassol, for example. And as one example, I grew up with this lovely name as a child birder in the 70s and 80s, as a very young birder. This lovely name, Emerald Spotted Wood Dove. And then it changed its name to Green Spotted Dove. And then sometimes it was called Green Spotted Wood Dove. Sometimes hyphens were removed, sometimes they were added back in. And the name just kept changing. And it was very confusing. Sometimes I was even reprimanded for using the wrong name because I was using the old name, or the person who reprimanded me might have not known that the name had changed. So very frustrating, really. And 30 or 40 years later, the name reverted to what I was using as a child, Emerald Spotted Wood Dove. So that's what we use today for the species. The biggest spate of bird names happened all at once. And the Robert 7 publication, working with the Fitzpatrick Institute, they made what at the time was a very logical decision, because they wanted to unify the bird names. They wanted to align South Africa's bird names with what people were using worldwide. So they decided to follow the IOC in terms of common names. So that did lose us things like Dickups and Luries and some classic South African bird names. And there was just a huge number of bird names that changed then in 2005. It was before we existed. So we only started what we were doing 5 years later. And we had no control over that, or no influence really. And one of those names that Robert Seven changed when they aligned with the IOC was this bird, which I've never seen in South Africa. I've seen it in southern Mozambique only. I don't know who of you have seen this bird in South Africa. Um, quite a localized bird in South Africa. Tembe Elephant Reserve is good for it. I used to call it blue-throated sunbird, but then the name changed to plain-backed sunbird. So yeah, the blue part of the text, I'm just stating that we're not going to go back and change things to what they were before. And I know Mel, um, he's in the audience and he might have a question later. Some people do think about going back and changing all the names, but I think many people just think that would be too confusing if we try to change names um, again from what they were many years back, long before the BirdLife South Africa List and Rarities Committee actually existed. So we as a committee aren't sort of going into that space, and we're not doing that. Um, Here's an example. Beautiful photo by Dom Rodinson. It's essentially an endemic bird to South Africa. Something I grew up with on family trips to the garden routes in South Africa. Knysna luri. I used to love calling it by the English name was actually spelt the Afrikaans way with an E in the name luri. And then I was not that happy some years later when the name changed to the sort of English form. So it became a U in the name luri. And then in 2005, this changed to Knysna terreco, which I wasn't personally happy with, but I had no control over it at all. And we had to accept that. It's not the end of the world. So yeah, bird is now called Knysna terreco, and that happened long before our time. So just to emphasize that we at the South African Bird List, the official South African Bird List, we list our official name, the one that we go through the voting process to sort of accept. That's our South African official name, such as Wandering Albatross. But then we'll place the alternate name in brackets. So we will place the fact that other people will call it Snowy Albatross in brackets. Same with the second example, Layard's Titbabbler. Scaly Feathered Finch. AviList is calling it Scaly Feathered Weaver. The IOC was calling it that, Scaly Feathered Weaver. We prefer the name we grew up with, so the official name is listed by default, but in brackets we acknowledge that many birders in other parts of the world, including East Africa, call it Scaly Feathered Weaver. And then Broad-tailed Warbler, it's got a very different name as well, Fan-tailed Grassbird. Both names are very commonly used. I grew up with the name Broad-tailed Warbler. Most South Africans who are as old as I am, I'm 52, called it Broad-tailed Warbler, so we're more accustomed to that name. There was a paper in the journal Ostrich by Bookman, we privileged to have him on the South African Bird List Rarities Committee, and then Colleen Downs, Professor Colleen Downs, who many of you know of. And yeah, they published a paper together, sort of recommending that field guide authors, if possible, use the official names of South Africa's birds. But of course, they're entitled to do whatever they want to. But the most recent SASOL, for example, they list our names, the official ones, but they also list the alternate names in brackets. So in fact, they do essentially the same as what we're doing. On the eBird app, you can actually choose South African English in the preferences. So even though our official names are a bit different from the eBird names in quite a few cases, you can set your app, if you do use eBird or any of the other Cornell apps, you can set it to our name. So Johnny Wilson had quite a lot to do with that, where he persuaded the guys there to use our names, but you do have to update or change the setting to South African English if you want to see our names. That's a picture of Wandering Albatross, the or what some people call snowy albatross now. And then, yeah, so here is the part that is sort of less than a month old, AviList, and this combined unified world list. And I'm almost at the end of the talk, but this is arguably the most important slide because I really want to ask for as much feedback as possible. So there's different ways of giving feedback. One of them is if you just scan that QR code, there's different ways of contacting the company that I'm a part of. And yeah, just if you put it for the attention of Chris, then I'll get it. So you can just email chris@birdingecotours.com. I think Kurt would have probably put the link in there, how to contact us. But yeah, please do give feedback about these possible changes, because we at the South African Bird List and Rarities Committee, we we haven't yet actually decided what to do with these very recent changes that AviList has made that are almost a month old. Because we first wanted to get feedback from everyone. We wanted to hear other people's opinions. I've already seen in the comments at the start and at the build up to this talk, a lot of people are saying they'd like to keep bleating warbler or bleating bush warbler for the Cameropterus. So yeah, basically AviList has changed. They've lumped green-backed and grey-backed Cameroptera into one now, and they proposed a new name, bleating Cameroptera, which I personally also prefer to revert to the old name, bleating warbler or bleating bush warbler. But I'd really like to hear from as many people as possible what to do with that. And then only after we've heard from everyone, as many people as possible, by the end of this month, please, if you don't mind, so by the end of July, then we will then discuss all the feedback given, and then among our committee of 24 people, and then we'll take a vote. And whatever the outcome of the vote is, we will go along with. So the other things that they've done, interestingly, yellow-billed and black kites, they've been lumped again. So when I was a child birder, they were lumped, and then they were split for some decades, and now they've been lumped again. The AviList is calling it black kite, so you have to lose one of the names, and they're losing the name yellow-billed kite and calling it black kite. If you don't mind giving feedback about that one as well. So the purple swamp hens, there used to be quite a few worldwide. They've all been lumped again. So we used to call our one African swamp hen, but we used to put purple in brackets. But now it's quite a widespread bird. It's in various different parts of the world. It's now going to be called purple swamp hen because it's been lumped according to AviList, but we still have to take our vote. So if you don't mind giving feedback, that'll be great. Cape and Agulhas long-billed larks have been lumped, and we're calling them all Cape long-billed lark. Very interesting thing happened with AviList. They actually split white tern into 3 different species. Etienne Marais, he got a photo of a white tern in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, I believe, which is really quite something. It's the only record that I know of in South Africa of white tern. And now that white tern's been split into 3 species, our committee is going to have to vote based on Etienne's photo as to which one we think it is. And it's probably common white tern. The photo seems to show sort of bluish at the base of the bill, and it shows features which sort of indicate that it probably is common white tern. But we have to actually scrutinize the photo as a committee and then take a vote. Also, I just want to mention that AviList uses Korhan for the small bastards that occur in South Africa and, well, in fact, the whole of Southern Africa. So they sort of listen to us, so to speak. They don't use tit babbler, I think, because there are Asian tit babblers that are unrelated. That's probably the reason. But for me, that doesn't matter. For example, there's 2 very different kinds of spine-tails. There's swifts, and there's also a very different kind of spine-tail in South America. And they're not related. And to me, it's not confusing to have the same English or common name for 2 unrelated groups that occur in different parts of the world. Um, AviList does use common hoopoe. Fortunately, they're not using Eurasian hoopoe, which would be just wrong. So, yeah, I'm hoping to get as much feedback as possible. And yeah, just one thing that in my penultimate slide is just how do we communicate these changes that we have made to the general birding public? So on the Excel list, which you can download, I gave the QR code earlier. Otherwise, you could just Google BirdLife South Africa checklists and then download it from there. And the Excel version that you can download from the BirdLife South Africa page, um, that has a tab on it showing changes that we made. And we give a reason for each change. So, and that gets updated very regularly, a few times a year. So you can always just go and look at the Excel list and it will be quite up to date. It'll tell you why something's changed, such as, for example, why there's no Agulhas longbill lark anymore. That'll be explained there. But also, yeah, if I'm ever invited to give a talk, I always tend to say yes to that. So I'll give talks trying to update people with updated information. Various members of the committee, they'll publish in African BirdLife magazine with updates. I think that David Ealer Smith told me earlier today that he's going to try and publish twice a year, I think, as far as I know. There's also external articles. Sometimes I write them, sometimes other people write them for Bird Club magazines, or sometimes on websites. For example, the Bird and Ecotours website, I wrote an updated article about the endemics of South Africa, which is a subset of our list. And yeah, you can just contact me with the QR code. You could just make it for the attention of Chris, and or just email me at birdingecotours.com. So yeah, so that was almost an hour of speaking, and hopefully there's a bit of time for questions. And I'd love to take some questions now, just to end off with what this amazing bird is that Dominique Rowlandson um, photographed in the Cape was striped flufftail. Um, and yeah, so thanks so much everyone for listening, and yeah, hope to be able to get some questions now.
Chris, thank you so much. That was an absolutely remarkable presentation, extremely insightful, and I think when the news hit the social media platforms, I think a lot of people found themselves in a position where they were panicked and worried, and I can imagine, especially when you and I even started out as birding, we were inundated with the sense of being overwhelmed when we opened up our field guides, and simply trying to learn the existing names was a challenge in itself. And now, just as some individuals have gotten to learn these names, and so starts some changes. And I think a lot of people were just really, really overwhelmed with everything. But thank you, and thank you for your involvement, chairing the listing committee, and also to everybody behind the scenes and members of the committee itself, all the stellar work that they're busy doing. I think before we kick off the Q&A session, I'm just going to pose that question which you briefly touched on, and that is, what do you think of the name Bleating Cameroptera? So this is all to the viewers who have dialed in here, and you can let us know in the comments section. So send those in. Ideally, if you could maybe not flood the Q&A box, because I still want to sift through those questions. So let us know in the comments section. What do you think of the name Bleating Cameroptera as the new name proposed by AviList? And that's going to be for the lumping of grey-backed and green-backed Cameroptera. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Or are you neutral? Do you care, in fact, that the Cameropters are being lumped, or what their name is? So let us know, please, in the comments section. And as Chris has indicated, the committee is interested in the public perception of these names and what people want and don't want. And it's important, everybody, that we communicate to the committee, who is obviously acting as a body on behalf of us as a birding community. Chris, Are you ready for these Q&As? There, there are there's some really good questions here. And everybody, we're going to do our best to get through to them, through all of them. And if
Yeah, so snowy albatross is the nominate one and the most widespread one. And then I believe Kristen, I think, may I ask someone else to, I think John or Dave might be able to answer that. John, you might be able to, someone who was on Flock could probably
Yeah, John,
answer
perhaps you could speak to
which
the
species
variation
have
in
become
the
a
wandering
split off that.
complex.
But
And welcome back, by the way, John.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry about that slight signal mishap. But yes, yeah. So the difference in the wandering complex is a tricky one, everybody. And yeah, it's certainly marginal differences. There's subtle sort of physical features in terms of bill length. Separating the species is extremely intricate, and one would almost be very hesitant to in fact try and separate these birds in the field. And I mean, it has led to hours upon hours upon hours of debate and debacle, even just trying to separate wandering from Tristan. So it's now separate wandering from Antipodean, from south of New Zealand or around Australia. It's just a whole other debacle and debate. So it really is tricky, and we find that with not just there's many birds obviously terrestrial based, but from a seabird perspective, it's very, very tricky. And even if I just take the diving petrels, for example, there are prominent physical features that one can use to separate these birds in the field, but realistically, you would want these birds in the hand. So it might not be the best bet for birders and those interested in ticking, but certainly the best bet for science in terms of conserving these species. Hopefully that answers that question.
okay,
Thanks,
John.
John. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie, for the question. Yeah, I was actually looking at those albatrosses earlier, so I should have known. But yeah, you can download it at avilist.org, the whole list, and then it'll show the different birds that were split off. So there's like a blue. You'll see when you download the list as well if you want more info. Yeah.
Excellent. So hopefully that answers that. Excellent question, everybody. Then Chris, yeah, another question that I saw came through earlier is firstly, thanks Kurt for stepping in as well. The value of our tech support system we're implementing, everybody. Just one of the questions that have come through, and it's featured prominently in the chat section as well. Obviously these names are busy changing, the common names, the names we're using on a daily and regular basis. Is there any implication on scientific names that these birds have? Is there any implication on other names as well? Afrikaans, those names generated by the South African Name for South African Birds Committee, SANSAB. What is the implication from us shifting to AviList, and what the effect that is going to have on other namings or names that we have for birds?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, who asked that question? Do you have a name there?
Chris, yeah, so there was a couple of people that have actually
Oh
asked
yeah.
it. I think it'll be
Okay.
quite broad, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a great question. So, uh, on the Excel bird list that you can download from the BirdLife South Africa website, it's actually got Zulu names and Afrikaans names, as well as the English names, and of course scientific names. We would like to add the other official languages in South Africa, but I mean, one day hopefully that will happen. But obviously we need the expertise and we need people helping us with that. Doing the Zulu and the Afrikaans lists are difficult enough, and the English one. Um, so whenever whenever new species that had never been recorded in South Africa gets recorded in South Africa, the Afrikaans list committee, which does actually exist, has to actually choose a name for it because there often aren't even Afrikaans names for all of the birds in the world. I don't think, at least not official South African names for them. So, um, there's the Afrikaans List Committee, um, which is now going to be headed up by Stefan Terblanche. That actually is the one that makes the name changes. So the committee that, or sorry, that decides on the names. So also the the chairperson of the Afrikaans list committee, he will be copied in on all future emails from our committee. So he'll basically know what we're doing and why, and then he'll discuss with the Afrikaans listing committee what then gets done. And then yeah, it's similar sort of thing with the Zulu working group. There's a Zulu names working group, and a similar sort of process will be followed. But yeah, and then we still have to actually start on all the other official names. So yeah, I mean it's really a great question. The scientific names are completely different, so it's much more difficult to change a scientific name. And unfortunately, there are still some offensive scientific names. For example, Hottentotus is still in the name, in the scientific name. And I wish that I could personally be involved with changing that. I simply don't have time. But it would be great if someone did work on that. But it would be quite a process. So scientific names are quite difficult to get changed. But it is possible. But it just needs someone or people working on it, probably scientific publications, peer-reviewed publications, really. I don't know if I answered that well enough. Just yeah, follow up with further if you want.
I think that was an excellent answer, Chris. And yeah, certainly speaking from my side, I'm fortunate to form part of that SANSAB committee, the South African Names for South African Birds. And I can testify for the fact that just the other day we actually had a meeting of the committee, and the working group for isiZulu bird names was busy discussing some of these recent splits and lumps. And quite right, for example, the red rump swallows, now they're being split, and there's a need to obviously create names for them in isiZulu. And very proud to have some leading authorities, linguists, professors, but also the involvement of our community bird guides, the likes of Temba Mtembu and Tabile Mtiani down in KwaZulu-Natal, who've provided vast amounts of input into those new names. So really great to see how they're getting involved in the process as well. So yes, everybody, very intricate this naming process. But Chris, I think an excellent answer there. So hopefully everybody is of the opinion as well. Having a look at another question that we received here, Chris. Um, there's a concern, or rather a question posed, in that, with us coming together now, all these global taxonomic authorities and this sort of single list having been created, is there this broader vision, this long-term vision of not having to necessarily update and change these common bird names as frequently? Because, I think many people tuning in here do have that. They buy a new field guide, and within a month or 2 months, the thing's out of date. There's new lumps, there's birds that have been separated, and I suppose moving forward in an age of technology, apps, are potentially the better option. But a lot of us love a field guide, a hard copy field guide in our hands, and I don't think we'll ever be able to replace that. But is there a long-term vision here that we're looking at? Are we trying to stop this constant and regular changing of names through combining or getting everybody around one table?
Yeah, I mean, what a great question. Yeah, so I think that I think there is a movement towards that, and I think that AviList will be trying to do that. Um, so yeah, I think they've got a process. But I think also when Robert Seven decided to follow the IC, I think we all were relatively naive at that point, where we actually thought we might just have to change them once. And then what none of us really expected was that the IC and other world lists would keep changing the names. So, I mean, I am kind of skeptical about whether it's really possible, and whether it really will happen. There is a movement towards it, and I am more positive than I was in the past. But yeah, I think splits and lumps, they're likely to continue happening, and with them, common names will change. Um, I don't really think there will just be haphazard common name changes for any reason as much as in the past. I certainly hope not. I like to be quite positive, and I think there is a sort of movement towards that. But yeah, different committees well, now luckily there is only one big world list now, so it's
Mm,
only one committee instead of three. That'll help. But then, yeah, I don't know what field guide authors will do, but I think this will help because a lot of very good field guides are now by BirdLife International and the Handbook of the Birds of the World, which is actually the same thing. They used to have their own list. Now they're going to use AviList. So I think that will bring a lot more stability
mm,
to things.
100%.
And yeah. So I think it's moving in the right direction quite strongly. Yeah. So yeah, I'm optimistic about it.
Excellent. And I see, Dave Ellis Smith, everybody who, as Chris alluded to at the start of this presentation, has been dialed in here in the background and on standby, and he's sent a message here saying, irrespective of having a single unified taxonomy, science is continually evolving and our knowledge keeps improving. So there's always going to be changes in taxonomic names, splits, and lumps going forward as our knowledge improves. And I think that's important to note here, everybody. It might, be a mild inconvenience, possibly even a large inconvenience for us as birders because, we have to get these new books and, we have to revisit our lists and it's frustrating because we can't keep tabs on everything. But, there is a bigger picture in mind here, and that is our understanding on birds and how we can work together to protect and to conserve them. I mean, that's why we give them names, because if we don't give something a name, we cannot begin to understand it. And if we don't understand something, we can't begin to conserve it. So, I think it speaks to a much bigger message here. And David touched on uh, our understanding and there being a need to split species. And Chris, there was a question here, and I think, it might benefit a lot of people who may not necessarily have a background in taxonomy or science necessarily. But what is the process involved in terms of splitting these birds? Is it morphological? Does it go down to DNA analysis, or is it distribution? What is the process involved in terms of splitting these birds for the most part?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So it's people do look at morphological features. That was always the way people used to decide what is a species. Should striped flufftail, for example, be a separate species compared to, say, red-chested flufftail? And then you look at the plumage and morphological characteristics like bill length and various other things. Um, but yeah, I mean, these days, uh, most sort of splits and lumps happen um, when scientists are looking at both morphological features as well as genetic data. So sequencing DNA has become so easy, um, and it used to be much more difficult than it is now. And a lot of other molecular techniques, not just DNA sequencing, um, is there's techniques that are available that were now that weren't in the past. So we can actually see whether the birds are genetically similar or genetically very different. So genetically similar birds would be dune lark and barlow's lark, which are probably genetically more similar than we thought. Um, whereas some cryptic species, such as, I mean, I can't think of a good example, but take for example southern and northern white-faced owls. They do look very similar, but genetically they're different enough. So because of the genetic techniques, we know that they are genetically different enough to um, to split. So yeah, I don't know if that answers properly. If you want to, yeah. Mm.
I think so. I think so, Chris. And it, I think basically everybody, it really just boils down to a bunch of things. It could be morphological, could be distribution, and I think a lot of these factors, Chris, are probably taken into account. It might not necessarily just be one of them. when looking at separating these birds. But it's not as if, somebody wakes up and says, oh, well, today I think we should split the species. There is a lot of time and debate involved around this. And like I said, there's a sort of a deeper purpose. Um, Chris, in the interest of time, and I'd love to sit and talk about this, for another hour, 2 hours. I'm sure those remaining online probably would as well. I'm going to take one more question, and it's just with regards to you touched now on dune and Barlow's lark. Um, if the Barlow's lark is a subspecies of dune lark, why is it not listed as dune slash Barlow's lark, or dune in brackets Barlow's lark? Much like is the same for rock loving or lazy cisticola. Is there any thought process behind that, or anything you could provide insight on?
Yeah, I mean it's good sort of feedback. So we the subspecies that occurs in South Africa is the Barlowi Barlowi form. So it's a subspecies. The third part of the scientific name is Barlowi. So we could put in brackets. We could acknowledge that. Um, but and yeah, we probably should. So I mean, it's something that I'll probably make a note of to discuss with the committee. We don't want to make it too complicated. Um, so it's where we've just recently changed the name. We particularly like to put in brackets what the old name was, but it's so we do that. Um, but we and that the main reason is just to sort of get people accustomed to what it was called before. But then a sort of secondary reason is to show what subspecies it was. And I think we probably should actually put Barlow's in brackets because the one in South Africa is the Barlow's subspecies. So I think it's actually very good feedback, and I will make a note of it. So yeah, thanks very much.
Excellent. That actually came from Tanya Anderson, Chris.
Oh,
So
great.
there we go, everybody. Visual, tangible evidence that the listing committee is taking into account, feedback from the public. So thanks, Tanya, for the question, Chris, for answering it. Chris, a final comment, less than a question. And when we wrap up, I think it's quite relevant. Linda Clokey says, "This is like a bird politics, crazy world, but also potentially a waste of energy." And there's a fabled saying that has transgressed the ages. There's many things one doesn't discuss at the dinner table. It is religion, politics, and taxonomy. Uh, but But I believe, Chris, that you have presented it in such a manner this evening that many people have understood it and can begin to understand why we are busy doing what we're busy doing, both from a South African perspective, but also the perspective from AviList and other global listing authorities. On behalf of myself, the Conservation Conversations team, and all 300 odd individuals who had attended this evening, we'd like to thank you for all that you do from a voluntary basis. And everybody, I'd like to encourage you to head over to the Birding Ecotours website, inquire info at birdingecotours.com about the 5% discount on any books, any tours that are booked up until the 15th, I believe, of July, and try and support the booking of tours through Birding Ecotours, please. It will benefit BirdLife South Africa. Any questions post this webinar, please feel free to send them through to us, either conversations@birdlife.org.za or directly through to Chris at info@birdingecotours.com. Chris, have a fantastic rest of your evening, and thank you once again. And it was truly, truly insightful. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Yeah, and yeah, really appreciate the questions and all the comments. And have a good evening, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks again, Chris, to the team at Birding Ecotours. We look forward to seeing you all on the next episode of Conservation Conversations. It is John Kinghorn, the host for the evening, Kurt Martin from Tech. Thank you for bearing with the Tech Gremlins, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Conservation Conversations. Good night.